As we take a look back at the first half of the Denver Broncos season, we're going to take a look at what was the most surprising, whether it be players, coaches, events, and we're also going to take a look at the most disappointing players, coaches, and things that have happened so far early on here in the season. Plus, we give a little bit of an outlook, a glance ahead at our expectations for the second half of the season. You get that and much more on this brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country who takes time out of their day to tune in and make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you watch us on YouTube. Do us all a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long, from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, Sayre expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, as we dive a little bit deeper here into the bye week, there's nothing going on with the Broncos in particular, right? We still do our show every single day, all year long. But it's nice to kind of be able to glance back now as we prepare for the second half of the season. But I think we have to look back at the first half, and I think going through the biggest surprises, biggest disappointments, I'm excited to dive into all that on today's brand new episode of the show.
That's right, man. A little reflecting, always good, especially when, the second half of the season is going to be huge. If the Broncos are going to make a playoff push, which they're still believing, as we talked about on yesterday's episode, George Paton said it, they're still believing that they can make a big run in the second half. So we got to look at reasons why they're believing that. And I think it's kind of nice too. The Broncos bye week, it doesn't always fall during the NFL trade deadline, but you know what? That's given us something to talk about. It gives us something extra to kind of, things are changing in Denver right now. So it changes things up a lot, actually, for the Broncos this year. It's kind of a big roster shift. But really, when you look at surprises on this team, Cody, I think offensively, and we're talking about surprises in the positive context, right? So we'll talk about disappointments coming up here, but surprises in the positive context, it's kind of an interesting exercise when you talk about the Denver Broncos offense, isn't it? When you're talking about who's been a positive surprise so far, I think lately it's really been Greg Dulcich, right? And that's where I would start things off, because we expected him all the way back in June to potentially take over tight end one duties. And Cody, I mean, that's kind of what I get was the vibe around Broncos, camp. I mean, not necessarily training camp at the time, but really you were there, so you can speak to that. But I feel like from my vantage point, it felt like Dulcich was taking that job, and obviously the injury derailed that. And given the fact he had to sit out the first 4 weeks, we didn't really know what to expect, especially hamstring injuries, as complicated as they are. I would say Greg Dulcich has been arguably, I know it's only been 3 weeks, I'd say he's arguably been the biggest surprise for the Broncos offense this year.
I mean, you can even make the argument lately, like in the last 3 weeks, he's been the Broncos offense in the last 3 weeks. I mean, probably one of the bigger components of that as well, especially with his impressive performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But no, I mean, I agree with you. In OTA, some of the things that we saw with Greg Dulcich was just the utilization of him against zone coverage, being able to sit and find the soft spot, and just his athleticism. And so far, what we've seen so far in 3 weeks of his debut in the National Football League has been just that. When he catches the ball, he's got this burst to him. He's got this size to him that the Broncos simply haven't had at the tight end position. So yeah, I would say when it comes to the offense, I mean, sadly, this is it. We only have one thing that's really surprised us on the offensive side of the ball, or a player that's really been the most surprising, which is kind of disappointing and kind of speaks to what we'll talk about when we get into the biggest disappointments so far that we've seen in the first half of the season. I will throw a little bit of an honorable mention out there to the tight end group in general. When we talk about Eric Saubert, I mean, he's caught a touchdown pass this year. He's been on the field quite a bit for them. Eric Tomlinson has been very underrated in the aspect of catching some passes. So I'd say Probably the most surprising thing for the offense in the first half of the season has been Denver's tight end group, minus, Albert Okwuegbunam, who's not really been utilized, and that's something we'll dive into a little bit later here on this very show here, Locked On Broncos. But, Sayre, let's talk about defense now, right? Because I think ideally, part of us, we're not surprised, but we're talking about players who have surprised us in a sense. We know the defense was going to be good coming into this year anyways, but I would say several players that have surprised us. I saw that you listed on your list Alex Singleton as your guy.
Yeah, Cody, I got to eat my weekly plate of crow regarding Alex Singleton. I think it's definitely, he was a guy that we kind of, me bagged on all offseason. I felt like, man, that was a special teams only pickup for the Denver Broncos. And if he had to play, the Broncos defense was going to be in trouble. That's the way that I felt. It's been the exact opposite. Now they're trying to find ways to get him on the field, it feels like. So really, Alex Singleton, to me, has been the biggest surprise when you talk about just where we were at with him in the offseason compared to what he's put out there on the field. He's going to get himself another contract. He's still a young guy, still got, the potential to go maybe year to year or maybe get a 2-year deal like Josie Jewell did last offseason. I think Alex Singleton is somebody who fits well in this defense. I think he's somebody who fits well with the culture of these guys. And he's done well not only on defense, but when he's been asked to play special teams. So really big surprise there for me from Alex Singleton.
Well, and against the Jacksonville Jaguars, we saw both he and Josie Jewell on the field at the same time. So I think Ejiro Evero, now it's like, okay, hey, you got Josie Jewell back from injury, but Alex Singleton's been playing so well, you can't necessarily keep a guy like Singleton off the field on defense, especially when he's your leading tackler on the team, and it's really not even close to the next guy. He's got, I think it's like 61, 62 total tackles on the team so far. Singleton has been completely different than what you and I had both expected. So gladly I will eat crow with you right there. The next guy I'm going to highlight is going to be K'Waun Williams. I feel like for the Broncos defense this season, he's been such a pillar against the run. He's been so underrated in pass coverage inside the slot. It seems like every single game, K'Waun is making some type of big play, whether it's a pass deflection, whether it's a big-time hit, whether it's blitzing off the edge and sacking a quarterback. We've seen K'Waun really rise up, and you and I both, like in the offseason, we had the conversation when the Broncos let Bryce Callahan walk and they signed K'Waun. We're like, Denver couldn't sign Bryce Callahan? Like, what was the deal with that? I think this is a big reason why when you look at the overall scheme and going with Ejiro Evero, who had experience watching K'Waun Williams twice a year, who was the passing game coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams defense, he was able to see it firsthand what K'Waun could do. He's a force there, and I tell you what, he's been doing it with one hand as well. His entire hand, his right hand's been wrapped up with a cast and a club. So, hey, K'Waun Williams, in my opinion, has been one of the biggest surprises as well on the defensive side of the ball. Is there anybody else defensively that has stood out?
Cody, I think that after all the talk this offseason, you got to mention Baron Browning a little bit because people were very concerned about the fact that he was moving from off-ball linebacker to the edge, wondering how's this going to work out? Why are you intentionally taking one of your best athletes off the field defensively? And that played into the whole situation there with Alex Singleton and the inside linebacker position as well. So it's one of those things where Baron Browning, I think, has been better than pretty much anybody expected, right? Off the edge, showing that, little glimpses here and there of Von Miller, shades of Von Miller. And that's not just a, hyperbole or pump up Baron Browning, but we've seen that explosiveness, that get off at the snap, the ability to bend around the edge and get to the quarterback as quickly as possible. He's certainly proven himself and obviously proven himself enough to the point the team felt comfortable trading Bradley Chubb and basically giving him a starting job the rest of the way and for who knows how long. So really great to see a pleasant surprise there for anybody that maybe had doubted whether Baron Browning could be a full-time edge player in the NFL.
Broncos country, Sayre and I, we are interested in who your biggest surprise players have been so far in the first half of the season on the offense and defensive side of the ball. Make sure you comment down below. If you're watching the video on YouTube, you can tweet us on Twitter. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But coming up here in just a moment, we're going to dive deep into which players or units have been the most disappointing in the first half of the season. We dive into that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Blue Nile, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And whether you're looking to pop the question or you have a milestone to celebrate and want to let your love sparkle, Blue Nile can help make your celebrations even more memorable. As the original online jeweler, Blue Nile offers the largest selection of independently graded diamonds and pieces priced significantly below traditional retailers, and Blue Nile has helped millions of couples create their perfect engagement ring. Their easy online tools let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as setting style, and Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then help you handcraft her perfect one-of-a-kind engagement ring. Looking for a fine piece of jewelry to commemorate a special milestone but still having trouble choosing? Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7, available via phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. So shop stress-free with Blue Nile's 100% satisfaction guarantee. All Blue Nile orders are insured and shipped for free in discreet packaging. They also offer overnight shipping if you are in a rush. Make your moment sparkle with Blue Nile. Go to BlueNile.com. Use code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. That's BLUENILE.com. Code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. BlueNile.com. Code LOCKEDON. As we dive into the second half action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll take a look at some of the biggest disappointments from the first half of the season. But before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day. Sayre, I feel like there's a lot to talk about in terms of disappointment from the first half of the season. I think everybody in Broncos country will be in agreement. Where the expectations were for this team, they certainly have not met them, especially from an offensive standpoint. So let's start off on the offensive side of the ball. And I think first off, one of the biggest disappointments so far in the first half of the season has really been new Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett and the play calling with the offensive side of the ball. Because right now, Denver has the worst offense in the NFL despite having a guy like Russell Wilson. To me, that is disappointing.
I'm 100% with you on that, Cody. I think definitely we expected better from Nathaniel Hackett. I don't know that we necessarily expected the Broncos offense to be scoring 35 points a game right away. But, you and I talked about this leading up to the season, and I think a lot of the listeners agreed there could be some growing pains as the Broncos get acclimated to life with a new quarterback and a new head coach / offensive play caller. I don't think we expected necessarily to see 14 points a game, which has been embarrassing to say the least. I mean, you got the ESPN crew as the Broncos are in London. You got Louis Riddick and Dan Orlovsky out there talking about how it looks like a high school offense and these type of things, when in reality, it's just, the Broncos running their basic concepts well for maybe the first time this season. So Nathaniel Hackett definitely been the biggest disappointment thus far. We'll see how he does in the second half. George Paton expressed that they are behind him. They're behind this coaching staff. That coaching staff is going to get the year, people. So unless the Broncos lose the rest of their games and something really goes drastically wrong, Nathaniel Hackett will probably be the head coach for the rest of this season. I think another disappointment, Cody, you got to look right at the center of the offensive line, literally Lloyd Cushenberry the third, and really speaking to just the fact that we expected progression in year 3. We haven't seen it. I don't know if it's necessarily been the loss of Mike Munchak or if it's the scheme change or what the case may be. The communication is just not there between Lloyd Cushenberry and the other offensive linemen on the interior. Not only that, Cody, but I just feel like he kind of gets bullied at the point of attack a little too often, and that has caused a lot of third down plays to be destroyed and broken up by defenses just coming right up the middle. So I think Lloyd Cushenberry been one of those disappointments on the offensive side of the ball. We'll see if Graham Glasgow can pick up the slack here starting off the second half of the season.
And I think Cushenberry has the cerebral fortitude to do some of the things that's required on this offense. But when it comes to the physical stuff, I mean, it's just you can't. You're not seeing it. It's not there consistently enough. And I think when your center is sometimes on the ground on big-time plays where there's a sack, you look back and you're like, why is the center on the ground? And I've said that with Lloyd Cushenberry quite a bit this season. Definitely been disappointing. I mean, we can maybe throw Dalton Reisner in there as well. I mean, he certainly hasn't had the season that he's expected because you really want to be able to get the run game going, and a lot of it starts with the offensive line. So if you can't get the run game going and you have to just resort to passing, and your pass protection as a team, as a unit, hasn't been very good, It's a recipe for disaster, but that's where the coaching has to come in, and they have to be better, more efficient with play calling and designing things to get the Broncos offense in rhythm. We'll see if we see more of that here in the second half of the season. But then there's another player as well. Let's talk about Melvin Gordon here for a moment, Sayre. I feel like the expectation with both he and Javonte Williams kind of is that 1-2 punch. We were all like, hey, this is great. The Broncos got a great deal by bringing Melvin Gordon back here to be the backup to Javonte Williams. And he got off to the worst career start stretch in his career with just various games of consecutive fumbles. I mean, it was not looking good. And then I would say that he's been better lately, right? I think we've seen an entirely different Melvin Gordon. He's protected the football. He scored a touchdown last week against the Jaguars. So I think that maybe it's kind of trending for a decent finish to the season for him, especially in the position that he's in now as the starter versus how he started off the year. So there is that on that. Any thoughts on the Melvin thing? And I know we're going to get to the defense.
It just pains me to think how different things could be this season if not for those 4 fumbles in the first 4 games, right? Especially that fumble in the Seattle Seahawks game to start the season. The Broncos should have been in a much different position all throughout that game. So it's just tough. It's not something that I think should be overlooked. And I don't think the Broncos did overlook it, Cody. You saw Melvin against the Los Angeles Chargers really got made an example of in that game. And it was ball security issues that I think led to the coaching staff maybe not necessarily even communicating very well with him about what they were planning on doing. But he really, that was a low point for him, I would say, for his career as a Bronco, really being on the sideline against his former team. So like you said, he's picked things up lately. We'll see how the rest of the season goes, but certainly Gordon still has a long way to go to earn Broncos country's trust at this point, if that's even possible. Certainly he's got a lot of things to accomplish out there, but with the Javonte Williams injury, like we've talked about in the past, we're going to see him get those opportunities to prove himself. We'll see how the new running back coming in, Chase Edmonds, Marlon Mack, obviously Latavius Murray, how that affects Melvin Gordon in the rotation going forward.
It's going to be a very interesting time here for this Broncos team. And let's now shift our transition to the defensive side of the ball. What's been like the biggest disappointment from the first half of the season? Sayre, I can't really pinpoint any players, right? Because the defense has really been the bright spot for this football team. But there's been aspects amongst the defense that has definitely been disappointing at times. And starting things off, the run defense as a whole has been very inconsistent. At one part, at the beginning of the season, they were one of the top-ranked units stopping the run. And then they've had games where they've allowed some explosive plays, and it really got kickstarted with the Josh Jacobs run game against the Las Vegas Raiders in Vegas in the Broncos-Raiders first matchup there. And he just war of attrition once again. And part of that, I think we can also equate to the offense. Denver's defense being on the field way too long. And then more recently, we saw an explosive output by Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I would say run defense and its inconsistency have definitely been probably one of the more disappointing things of the season. But realistically, the other thing that's been disappointing is availability. Losing some key guys, that's kind of stunk.
Yeah, injuries are ruining the fun, Cody. I mean, this Broncos defense is unreal as it is, and we've seen them trade now one of their best players. I still think this is going to be a top 5 to top 10 defense the rest of the way, and that's without Ronald Darby out there. That's without Randy Gregory out there. That's without, Justin Simmons for 4 games. That's without Caden Stearns now. I mean, the injuries, Josie Jewell has missed plenty of time. It's been kind of crazy, the amount of injuries this defense has sustained and how the drop-off just hasn't been there. So the only disappointing thing is that we're not seeing the top players out there consistently. Now, Baron Browning has missed, some time. So really, you could look up and down the list at guys that have missed games, and the Broncos are still playing great defense. I think that the biggest disappointment there is just the fact that we've been robbed of the fun of seeing everyone healthy consistently on that defense, and that hopefully will change here in the second half.
That's a big one too, especially with Ronald Darby. He was playing really good football for the Broncos opposite of Patrick Surtain. It's just unfortunate to see their injuries. No fun. We'll see if the Broncos can finish the second half of the season healthy, get some guys back as well, and keep playing that strong level of defense. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. Sayre and I, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the second half outlook. Who do we expect to step up, including a Bronco that many people didn't think would be here after the the NFL trade deadline. We get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode. Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and the easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. In terms of second half of the season expectations, the Broncos' schedule is absolutely brutal, at least on paper. But if the Broncos can go on a run here, there could be some exciting things in store here for Broncos Country. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day. Sayre, let's talk about some players or some things that we expect to step up in the second half of the season for this Broncos football team. I think it's interesting. A guy that you and I, and really the writing on the wall with just how he's been used and all of a sudden becoming a game day inactive for 3 straight weeks. We didn't think Albert Okwuegbunam would still be on the roster following the NFL trade deadline. And Broncos GM George Paton came out on Tuesday after the trade deadline. He actually gave some praise here for Albert O and says that the team is going to need him. Very interesting here by General George.
You know, Cody, the interesting change in kind of the winds here. It's not just the fall. It's not just daylight savings. Is George Paton listening to Locked On Broncos? Did he hear our cry for more Albert O? And is he responding thusly? I mean, you can't help but think the writing was on the wall as of a couple of weeks ago when Albert O was a healthy scratch immediately upon Greg Dulcich's arrival to the lineup. Then everybody starts thinking, all right, well, Albert O must be getting traded, because if he has no role in this offense when Dulcich is healthy, then that means that he's probably not got a role on the team at all. I think, Cody, now looking back, George Paton obviously understands and realizes you can't just be giving away talented offensive weapons like Albert Okwuegbunam. And I'm glad that he realized that. And I'm glad that he realized that with a lot of other guys that were talked about leading up to the trade deadline, because you got Russell Wilson and this offense struggling to find their footing in the first half. And what did George Paton say at his press conference? He felt like the offense is trending in the right direction. And if that's the case, at some point, if the offense starts clicking, maybe you could throw Albert O into the mix, right? Maybe you could say, let's get him out there as a big slot again, or let's get him out there on the field at the same time as Greg Dulcich. Let's do some different things out here and get him involved some way, somehow, because I mean, how many times can you say it? The guy is 6'6", 260, runs a 4.49 in the 40-yard dash. Yes, he's had issues with dropped passes, but I think that the biggest nightmare that we could envision after the trade deadline is seeing Albert O out there for some team that's competing for a playoff spot, sprinting down the middle of the field, catching a pass across the middle and going for 40, 50 yards because of his big-time speed. That's something that we need to see the Broncos figuring out a way to make happen, not some other team, not getting him as a reclamation project for 1.5 years, which he's still under contract for next year. I think, Cody, you got to figure it out with Albert O. He's simply too talented to leave inactive week after week. The Broncos got to find a way to involve him.
I agree with you, and I like the idea, because even before the season even began, you and I have talked about, man, could you just imagine the Broncos go with double tight and they use both these guys in the slot or put one guy on the outside? I mean, you could get creative. You have personnel that has some explosiveness to it. It's a good problem to have. I mean, it really is for the Broncos, and the fact that Albert O was not traded away, I think, is a great sign here going forward for this Denver Broncos football team. But another thing I think we absolutely have to touch on in terms of like second half expectations, I mean, Sayre, is it cliche to say that the offense has to be better? I mean, I think we all know it has to be better, but we want to actually see the offense be better. And I don't know, can you build off what you did in Jacksonville? Everyone's going to say, oh, well, they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars. You know, there's a guy in the Fast and the Furious series, his name's Dom Toretto. It says, winning is winning. And that's really what you have to do. You have to find a way to get any win that you can going forward. And I think that's for where this Broncos team is at. I think that they can beat the Tennessee Titans. And if they go on the road in Nashville and do that to come out of the bye, I tell you what, it could set the table for some brand new momentum for this football team. Even though that a lot of people have written the season off, and from our lens looking at it, I mean, when you look at the AFC right now, yeah, I mean, making the playoffs in the AFC right now, it doesn't seem very realistic at this point. But as Kevin Garnett also said, anything is possible.
Anything is possible. And like the great Dom Toretto said, Cody, it don't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Like you said, winning is winning. That's it. And I think that, you look at the second half, the Broncos really have their destiny in their hands. They play a lot of big-time AFC opponents in the second half of the season. They're going to get a chance to go on the road and go get a bunch of wins. I'm looking at the uniform schedule here, Cody. We could see those blue and orange pants with the white tops a couple of times. We got the color rush jerseys coming up in week 11. The good vibes are coming. The Broncos have a big opportunity here. You start off with the Tennessee Titans, then you have teams like the Raiders and teams like the Panthers. You have opportunities to get back on the saddle here as an offense and really get things clicking, really get things going. These are all NFL teams. Of course, anything can happen, as we know and as we have seen. But, man, you can't help but be optimistic after getting a win, after seeing your offense finally eclipse 20 points, after finally seeing the offense get going and get a lot of different guys involved in the mix. It's something to build on for sure. And like George Paton said, trending in the right direction. That's all you could ask for after the dismal start that we saw for this offense to open up the 22 season.
Broncos country, we want to know your thoughts on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Who are your biggest surprises in the first half of the season? Who are the biggest disappointments? And what are some of your expectations here for the second half? Make sure you comment on the prompts down below. If you're watching on YouTube, you can tweet us on Twitter. If you're listening to the audio podcast version of this episode, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. We appreciate you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in. We have some more content coming your way this week as the Broncos go through the bye week blues, but it could just be what the doctor ordered as the Broncos maybe get healthy. They can get some plans in place as they now prepare for the Tennessee Titans in just about a week and a half, 2 weeks time here for this Broncos football team. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.